The hallways of Robertson Conservatory echoed with music. Students practiced their scales, professors delivered stern critiques, and occasional sighs of frustration punctuated the air. Among it all, Lillian Porter moved like a shadow, arranging sheet music and dusting piano keys with practiced efficiency. At 38, Lillian blended seamlessly into the background. Her chestnut hair was pulled back in a simple braid, her blue dress unremarkable, her movements economical. 6 weeks into her position as an administrative assistant, most faculty barely registered her presence, exactly as she preferred, Ms. Porter, these need to be organized by composer, not chronologically, Dr. Constance Whitmore said sharply. The head of piano studies barely glanced up from her leather planner. Of course, Dr. Whitmore. I'll fix it right away, Lillian replied, softly, taking the stack of sheet music from the professor's manicured hands. Dr. Whitmore gave a curt nod before continuing down the corridor, her heels clicking rhythmically against the marble floors. Lillian watched her go, a faint smile playing at the corners of her mouth. As she reorganized the music, her eyes lingered on a particularly difficult Liszt transcription. Her fingers twitched almost imperceptibly, muscle memory awakening at the sight of the familiar notations. 5 years since she'd performed. 5 years since she'd played in public. Daydreaming on the job, Miss Porter? Professor Walter Thornton's voice startled her. The elderly composition teacher peered at her through wire-rimmed glasses, his bow tie slightly askew as always. Just organizing, Professor, Lillian answered quickly, shuffling the papers into proper order. When you're done with that, Madame, Dubois needs help preparing for tomorrow's scholarship event. Something about program notes. I'll head there straight away. Professor Thornton lingered, watching as she efficiently completed her task. You know, for someone who claims no formal musical training, you organize those pieces as if you understand their complexity. Lillian kept her eyes down. I've picked up a few things working here. In 6 weeks? Impressive, he said, though his tone suggested skepticism rather than admiration. Just remember, Ms. Porter, understanding music requires more than familiarity with paper and ink. It takes years of discipline, talent, and proper breeding. Lillian nodded demurely. I wouldn't presume otherwise, Professor. Later that afternoon, Lillian knocked gently on the office door of Madame Elizabeth Dubois, the conservatory's revered French performance coach. Entree, came the imperious command. Madame Dubois sat behind her desk, spectacles perched on her nose, surrounded by stacks of papers. At 65, she remained formidable, her silver hair coiled in a perfect chignon, her posture ballet straight. Ah, Ms. Porter, finally. These program notes are a disaster. I need them retyped and ready for tomorrow's scholarship competition. The donors expect perfection. Of course, madam. Lillian accepted the stack, noticing the handwritten corrections in red ink bleeding across the pages. And please ensure there are no mistakes this time. I can't have another embarrassment like last week's recital programs. Lillian bit back a response. The embarrassment had been a single misplaced accent in a French composer's name, something Madame Dubois had actually written incorrectly herself, though Lillian would never point that out. I'll be meticulous, she promised instead, as Lillian turned to leave. Her attention caught on the open score on Madame's piano, Liszt's transcription of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, the very piece she'd been looking at earlier. Is this what Gregory Palmer will be playing tomorrow? She asked before she could stop herself. Madame Dubois raised a perfectly arched eyebrow. Yes. What of it? Lillian hesitated, then continued carefully. A challenging choice for a student. Mr. Palmer is our most gifted pupil. Challenging is precisely what he needs. Madame Dubois narrowed her eyes. Though I hardly think you're qualified to assess the difficulty of a Liszt transcription, Miss Porter. You're right. I apologize for overstepping. The morning of the scholarship competition arrived with nervous energy buzzing through the conservatory. Donors in expensive suits and pearls mingled with faculty in the grand foyer, while students secluded themselves in practice rooms making last-minute preparations. Lillian arrived early, dressed in her nicest navy dress, her hair braided more carefully than usual. Today's events would determine which promising young musicians received the coveted Robertson Scholarship, a full ride that could launch careers. "Miss Porter, thank heaven you're here," Professor Thornton called, waving her over to where he stood with a cluster of board members. "The programs, please." She handed him the neatly printed stack, warm from the press room. "Excellent. Now we need you to assist backstage. The students are in various states of panic, as usual." Backstage was indeed chaos. Young performers paced, practiced finger movements silently, or sat with eyes closed, visualizing their performances. Gregory Palmer, the conservatory's star pupil, stood apart from the others, his face pale, hands trembling slightly. "Mr. Palmer, are you all right?" Lillian approached him cautiously. The young man looked up, barely seeing her. "Fine," he mumbled unconvincingly. "You're playing the list, aren't you? I heard you practicing yesterday. It sounded beautiful." Gregory blinked, finally focusing on her. You were listening?" Lillian smiled gently. "It's hard not to when something's played with such feeling." "But the technical passages," he started, then shook his head. "I don't know if I can do it. Not today. Not with them all watching." A familiar pang went through Lillian's chest. The memory of stage fright, of pressure so intense it felt physical. "May I?" she asked, gesturing to his score. He handed it over, looking confused. Most administrative staff couldn't read music beyond the basics. Lillian flipped to the passage she'd heard him struggling with. "You're approaching this sequence too aggressively," she said softly. "List is power, yes, but it's about control, not force. Try thinking of it as waves rather than lightning." Gregory stared at her. "How do you know that?" Lillian handed the score back quickly, realizing her mistake. "Just something I heard Madame Dubois tell another student once." Before he could question her further, Dr. Whitmore swept backstage, clipboard in hand. "Places, everyone. Mr. Palmer, you're opening the program." She turned to Lillian with a dismissive gesture. "Ms. Porter, please ensure the green room remains quiet." As Lillian retreated, she heard Gregory whisper to himself, "Waves, not lightning. Waves." From the green room, Lillian listened as the scholarship competition began. Dr. Whitmore's voice echoed through the speaker system, welcoming the distinguished guests and explaining the importance of the day's events. The perfect acoustics of the recital hall carried every note clearly to where Lillian sat. Gregory played first, his performance solid, if not inspired. He took Lillian's advice on the difficult passage, managing it more smoothly than in practice. When he finished, the applause was appreciative but not overwhelming. One by one, the other students performed, some brilliantly, others succumbing to nerves. Lillian listened carefully to each, her trained ear catching nuances most would miss. During an intermission, Madame Dubois entered the green room looking harried. "Miss Porter, I need you to take these refreshments to the judges' table," she instructed, gesturing to a tray of water glasses. "And do be inconspicuous." As Lillian carefully approached the judges' table, she overheard Dr. Whitmore speaking in hushed tones to Professor Thornton. Palmer completely misinterpreted the list. Too controlled in the allegro, too tentative in the crescendos. "I've told Elizabeth her technique is becoming outdated," Thornton replied, sipping his coffee. "These modern students need firm direction, not French philosophizing about feeling the music." Lillian placed the water glasses down silently, but not before Professor Thornton noticed her presence. "Ah, our resident eavesdropper," he said, loud enough for Dr. Whitmore to look up sharply. "Tell me, Miss Porter, what did you think of Mr. Palmer's performance?" It was clearly meant to embarrass her, to put her in her place, but something in Lillian, perhaps the music still ringing in her ears, perhaps the memory of her own teachers, made her answer honestly. "I thought his technique was excellent, but he hasn't yet found the piece's heart." Liszt's transcriptions aren't just technical exercises, they're reinterpretations that should capture both composers' souls. The silence that followed was deafening. Dr. Whitmore's teacup froze halfway to her lips. "I beg your pardon," Professor Thornton sputtered. Lillian blushed, dropping her gaze. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have spoken. It's not my place. No, it certainly is not, Dr. Whitmore snapped. Please return to your duties, Miss Porter, and leave the artistic assessments to those qualified to make them. As Lillian hurried back to the green room, she missed the puzzled look that passed between the professors, the first seed of suspicion taking root. The final portion of the scholarship competition was set to begin after a short intermission. The conservatory's recital hall was filled to capacity. Wealthy donors, faculty, family members of the performers, and fellow students all packed into the elegant space. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over the audience, and the polished wood panels seemed to vibrate with anticipation. Backstage, however, a crisis was unfolding. What do you mean he can't perform? Dr. Whitmore's voice, though hushed, carried an edge sharp enough to cut glass. The Danson Foundation representatives are here specifically to hear the list. Gregory Palmer sat on a bench, head between his knees, breathing erratically. His right hand trembled uncontrollably. I can't feel my fingers, he gasped between breaths. They're numb. Madame Dubois knelt beside him, concern etched deep in her face. A panic attack, I believe. It happens, even to the most talented. This is unacceptable, Dr. Whitmore hissed. The Danson donation hinges on today's performances. They specifically requested a list piece. Professor Thornton paced the small backstage area, his bow tie now completely askew. Can another student step in? With no preparation? Impossible. The list transcription is exceptionally difficult. None of our other students have prepared it. Lillian stood quietly in the corner, watching the scene unfold. The pieces of music on the piano, Liszt's transcription of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, seemed to call to her. 5 years since she'd touched a piano in public. 5 years of, healing of doubt. What about Michelson or Jang? Thornton suggested desperately. Michelson performed already and Yang is a violinist, Dr. Whitmore snapped. We have no options. We'll have to cancel the final performance. Explain there's been a medical emergency, Madame Dubois said grimly. Dr. Whitmore's face paled. The Danson Foundation will withdraw their offer. That's nearly $2 million in scholarship funds gone. As the professors argued in increasingly agitated whispers, Lillian found herself moving forward, drawn to Gregory's hunched form. She knelt beside him, opposite Madame Dubois. Gregory, she said softly, take a deep breath. Hold it for 4 counts, then release for 8. The young man tried to follow her instructions, his breathing gradually becoming less erratic. The numbness is normal, she continued, her voice gentle but certain. It will pass, but you need time. There is no time, Dr. Whitmore interjected. We go on in 5 minutes. Actually, Lillian said, rising to her feet, her voice steadier than it had been in years. I could play instead. 3 pairs of astonished eyes turned to her. Professor Thornton recovered first, letting out a bark of laughter. You? Don't be absurd, Miss Porter. This isn't the time for jokes. I'm not joking, Lillian replied, meeting his gaze. You're an administrative assistant, Dr. Whitmore said slowly, as if explaining to a child. This is one of the most technically challenging pieces in the piano repertoire. I'm aware of its difficulty. Madame Dubois studied Lillian's face, something shifting in her expression. You said you had no musical training. I never actually said that, Lillian corrected gently. You all assumed. The 3 professors exchanged glances, desperation warring with disbelief. This is preposterous, Dr. Whitmore declared. We cannot send an unqualified staff member to perform for the Danson Foundation. From the recital hall they could hear the audience growing restless. The intermission had already run long. What choice do we have? Madame Dubois asked, her French accent more pronounced in her distress. We can either send Miss Porter or admit we have no performer. Professor Thornton shook his head vigorously. This will be a disaster. Dr. Whitmore closed her eyes briefly, calculations running behind her tightly drawn expression. When she opened them, her decision was made. Fine, she said tersely. Miss Porter will play. The piece is 14 minutes long. If nothing else, it buys us time to formulate an explanation to the donors. She turned to Lillian, her gaze cold. Do you even know the piece? Yes, Lillian said simply. This is completely irregular, Professor Thornton continued to protest. We know nothing about her abilities. We know nothing about her at all, it seems. We know nothing about her at all, it seems, Madame Dubois murmured, still studying Lillian with newfound curiosity. Dr. Whitmore stepped close to Lillian, lowering her voice to a threatening whisper. If you embarrass this institution, your employment will be terminated immediately. Do I make myself clear? Lillian nodded once, her heart beginning to race, not with fear, but with a long, dormant excitement. As they ushered her toward the stage, Professor Thornton thrust the sheet music into her hands. At least try to look at this while you play. Pretend you know what you're doing. Lillian accepted the pages with a small smile. I won't need these, but thank you. Before any of them could respond to this astonishing statement, the stage manager gestured urgently. We're on in 30 seconds. Dr. Whitmore took a deep breath, plastered on a professional smile, and walked onto the stage to address the audience. Ladies and gentlemen, due to an unexpected circumstance, Gregory Palmer will be unable to perform. However, we are fortunate to have another pianist who will present Liszt's transcription of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. As she spoke, Lillian closed her eyes, flexing her fingers gently. After 5 long years of recovery and doubt, Lillian Porter, once known to the world as the brilliant Lillian Kurtz, was about to play again. The polite applause that greeted Lillian as she walked onto the stage was perfunctory at best. In the front row, Dr. Whitmore sat rigidly beside Professor Thornton, both wearing fixed smiles that didn't reach their eyes. Madame Dubois, however, leaned forward slightly, her gaze intense and curious. The magnificent grand piano gleamed under the stage lights, its lid propped fully open. Lillian approached it with reverence, adjusting the bench with practiced ease. This simple action, so familiar to any pianist but so precise in her execution, caused a subtle shift in the audience's attention. Seated at the instrument, Lillian took a moment to center herself. 5 years of physical therapy, of rebuilding, strength in her damaged hands after the accident, had led to this moment. She hadn't planned it, hadn't known today would be the day she'd return to a piano bench in front of an audience. Yet here she was. She placed her hands on the keys. From the first commanding chords of Beethoven's iconic symphony, transformed through Liszt's revolutionary piano adaptation, it was clear to everyone in the recital hall that something extraordinary was happening. Lillian's fingers moved with impossible precision, drawing sounds from the instrument that seemed beyond human capability. The famous 4-note motif resonated through the hall with all the power of an orchestra, yet with an intimacy only a solo piano could provide. In the audience, a transformation was taking place. Polite attention became stunned disbelief, which quickly turned to rapt amazement. Dr. Whitmore's fixed smile slipped away, replaced by wide-eyed shock. Professor Thornton sat forward in his seat, glasses sliding down his nose unnoticed. As Lillian moved into the development section, her interpretation revealed not just technical mastery but profound emotional understanding. This wasn't merely an accurate rendering of notes on a page. This was music brought to vibrant life, reimagined through the hands of someone who understood both Beethoven's revolutionary vision and Liszt's pianistic genius. Madame Dubois was the first to visibly react. A soft "Mon Dieu" escaped her lips as recognition dawned on her face. She clutched Professor Thornton's arm, whispering urgently, "C'est elle. C'est Lillian Kurtz." The name rippled through the audience in hushed whispers. Lillian Kurtz, the prodigy who had taken Europe by storm. 15 years ago, Lillian Kurtz, whose career had been cut short by a terrible accident. Lillian Kurtz, who had disappeared from the public eye 5 years ago after a disastrous comeback attempt in Vienna. On stage, Lillian was transported, reconnected to the part of herself she'd locked away for so long. Her hands, once damaged and weak, now moved with confident strength, drawing forth cascades of notes that filled the hall with glorious sound. The most challenging passages, the very ones Gregory had struggled with, flowed from her fingers as naturally as breathing. Where the young student had approached the piece with admirable technique but tentative emotion, Lillian played with the wisdom of someone who had known both triumph and devastating loss. Dr. Whitmore's face had lost all color. Professor Thornton repeatedly removed and replaced his glasses, as if the action might change what he was seeing and hearing. Only Madame Dubois seemed to have recovered from the initial shock, her eyes now glistening with unshed tears. As Lillian approached the final movements, she allowed herself to look up, to connect with the audience she had avoided seeing until now the expressions that met her gaze weren't just impressed, they were transformed. The wealthy donors, the critical faculty, the competitive students, all were united in the singular experience of witnessing true artistry. With power and delicacy and perfect balance, Lillian brought the piece to its conclusion, the final chords, resonating through the hall with commanding presence, then silence. For 3 heartbeats, the entire room remained frozen, suspended in the aftermath of what they had just witnessed. Then the audience erupted. The standing ovation was immediate and thunderous. People who had been sitting in polite attention moments before were now on their feet, applauding with unrestrained enthusiasm. A few were wiping away tears, others calling "Brava!" In the back row, a distinguished-looking elderly patron was openly weeping. Lillian remained seated at the piano for a moment, hands resting lightly on her lap, her eyes closed as she absorbed the sound washing over her. Not of music this time, but of genuine appreciation. When she finally stood and turned to acknowledge the audience with a modest bow, the applause only intensified. Dr. Whitmore sat frozen in her seat, the color still drained from her face. Beside her, Professor Thornton had finally given up trying to maintain his composure and was shaking his head in disbelief, mouth slightly agape. Only Madame Dubois had joined the standing ovation, her eyes bright with emotion. As Lillian took a second bow, she noticed Gregory Palmer standing in the wings, his panic attack forgotten in the wonder of what he had just witnessed. She offered him a gentle smile before turning back to the audience. Dr. Whitmore finally found her ability to move and stood abruptly, making her way to the stage with mechanical steps. Taking the microphone, she addressed the still applauding audience. "Ladies and gentlemen, please," she said, her voice betraying a slight tremor. "It appears we owe you an explanation." She turned to Lillian, struggling to maintain her composure. "Would you care to introduce yourself properly, Miss Porter? Or should I say, Miss Kurtz?" A hush fell over the crowd as Lillian stepped forward. For years she had hidden her identity, buried her past. Now, standing in the warm stage lights, she felt a weight lifting. "Yes," she acknowledged simply. "I am Lillian Kurtz." The revelation sent another ripple of excitement through the audience. An older gentleman in an expensive suit leaned toward his companion, whispering loudly enough to be heard. "Kurtz, the greatest interpreter of Liszt of her generation." Dr. Whitmore's smile had turned brittle. "Perhaps you could explain to our audience why one of the world's most celebrated pianists has been working as an administrative assistant at our conservatory for the past 6 weeks." The question was meant to embarrass her, but Lillian faced it with newfound confidence. "5 years ago, I suffered an injury that doctors believed would end my career," she explained, her voice steady. "After multiple surgeries and years of rehabilitation, I wasn't sure if I could or should return to performing. I needed to test myself, to rediscover my relationship with music away from the pressures of the concert stage." She glanced at the faculty members who were listening with varying degrees of chagrin. "The Robertson Conservatory's reputation for excellence drew me here. I wanted to immerse myself in music again, to observe and learn before deciding my next steps." Madame Dubois joined them on stage, her elegant composure restored. "Why didn't you tell us who you were?" she asked, though her tone suggested she already understood. "Would you have treated me the same if you had known?" Lillian responded gently. The question hung in the air, unanswerable but pointed. Dr. Whitmore had the grace to look uncomfortable, while Professor Thornton suddenly became very interested in straightening his bow tie. From the audience, a distinguished, silver-haired man stood up. Ms. Kurtz, I'm Robert Danson. My foundation came today hoping to fund promising new talent, but instead we've witnessed a triumphant return. Would you consider giving a master class to our scholarship recipients? Before Lillian could respond, Dr. Whitmore stepped forward, eagerly. The Robertson Conservatory would be honored to host Ms. Kurtz for a series of master classes, she announced, her voice suddenly warm with enthusiasm. In fact, we've been in discussions about a potential artist-in-residence position. Lillian raised an eyebrow but said nothing about this blatant fabrication. Mr. Danson smiled. Excellent. In that case, I believe we can increase our funding commitment. Talent deserves nurturing. Wouldn't you agree, Dr. Whitmore? As the two began discussing details, Professor Thornton approached Lillian, adjusting his glasses nervously. Miss Kurtz, he began, his earlier condescension replaced with awkward deference. I want to apologize for not recognizing your extraordinary talent. You never looked for it, Professor, Lillian replied without rancor. We often see only what we expect to see. He nodded uncomfortably, then added, I hope you'll consider staying on, in a more suitable position, of course. As the professors crowded around her, suddenly eager to claim association with the famous Lillian Kurtz, Gregory Palmer approached hesitantly from the wings. Lillian noticed him and excused herself, stepping away from the fawning faculty. That was, I've never heard anything like it, the young pianist said, awe evident in his voice. You will, Lillian assured him, with time and the right guidance. Will you teach me? He asked, hope brightening his features. I'd be honored, she replied sincerely, but only if you promise to play for yourself, not for them. She gestured toward the faculty and donors now engaged in animated conversation. In that moment, looking at the young musician's earnest face, Lillian realized what her next chapter would be. Not a return to the isolating life of a touring virtuoso, but here, teaching, mentoring, sharing the wisdom her journey had given her. 1 month later, Lillian Kurtz sat in her new office at the Robertson Conservatory. The nameplate on the door read Artist in Residence, a position created specifically for her after her triumphant return to the piano. Dr. Whitmore and Professor Thornton had become almost painfully respectful, constantly seeking her approval for departmental decisions. Only Madame Dubois treated her with natural warmth, neither overly reverent nor apologetic for the past. As Lillian reviewed applications for her masterclass, a knock came at her door. Gregory Palmer entered carrying his sheet music for his upcoming recital. Professor Kurtz, he greeted her with a smile. I've been practicing that passage as you suggested. Let's hear it, she said, gesturing to the piano in the corner. As Gregory began to play, Lillian reflected on how quickly everything had changed. Sometimes the greatest revelations come not from hiding who we are, but from finally having the courage to reveal it. In the warm afternoon light, surrounded by music, and a young artist's determination, Lillian felt at peace. The quiet pianist had found her voice again,